I have been an analyst for 31 years. I have reviewed 11,000 hours of combat footage across 4 separate theaters, filed assessments on 19 distinct species, and written the foundational classification framework the Directorate still uses to categorize what we call variable aggression combatants, species whose battlefield behavior cannot be predicted from their physiological baseline alone. I developed that framework because the existing one kept producing errors. The existing one assumed that aggression and capability were linearly related. Put enough pressure on a thing, the framework said, and it will either break or escalate. Those were the only 2 outputs. The model was clean, defensible, and supported by the full weight of our engagement history across multiple species. I used it for 16 years before I began to notice the category of exception it could not accommodate. I want to be precise about this up front because what I am about to describe is not a failure of the data. The footage is clean. The after-action reconstructions are accurate to within 4% on timeline and within 7% on positional modeling. The prisoner interviews were conducted under verified non-coercion protocols by 2 independent interviewers with no prior exposure to the subjects. I have reviewed everything 3 times. I retained a second analyst from the Strategic Modeling Division to run independent verification on the positional reconstructions for all 3 engagements. Her numbers match mine. I am not describing a methodology failure. I am describing a category failure. The review was scheduled as a standard damage assessment. 3 separate engagements in the Keth Voren approach corridor, spanning 11 days, involving human special operations units operating in what our pre-engagement analysis had classified as a contested denial zone, territory they were holding, we assumed, because they had not yet chosen to yield it. The Directorate's interest was administrative at the outset. We had taken light casualties in the first 2 engagements, achieved our positional objectives in 2 of the 3, and recovered 17 prisoners across the full period. The assessment was supposed to explain the cost discrepancies, specifically, why the 3rd engagement had run 40% over projected loss tolerance when the first 2 had come in within acceptable parameters, and to recommend classification adjustments for the human units involved. That was the scope of the work as described to me on the day I received the assignment. I note this because I want it understood that I did not begin this review looking for what I found. I was looking for a planning error, a surveillance gap, a calibration mistake in the pre-engagement human strength estimates. Those would have been clean findings with clear remedies. I was not looking for a category failure, because in 31 years, the category failures are the ones that take longest to admit, and they are the ones that change the most downstream. Assessment Theater 12 was at capacity. 8 members of the Combined Arms Review Directorate occupied the upper gallery, the tiered rows of polished black composite seating arranged above the footage wall in the clean institutional configuration they always hold, overhead panels giving everything a cool, even light. The kind of light that makes analysis feel precise, that makes numbers feel authoritative. Director Velhanen sat at the center of the upper row with Subdirector Ora Sethais to his left. The remaining 6 Directorate members filled the lower gallery rows in order of seniority. I stood at the analyst's position on the floor, with the footage wall behind me and the interface panel at my right hand. I had been told to keep the presentation to 2 hours. For the record, it ran to 4 hours and 11 minutes. At no point did Director Velhanen ask me to stop. I want to begin with the prisoners, I told them before we look at the footage. This is not the standard order. Footage first, analysis after that is the standard order, and I have followed it for 31 years. I want to invert it because I made the mistake of watching the footage first. And I think if you watch the footage without the prisoner data, you will reach the same wrong conclusions I did. We will have to backtrack, and the backtracking will cost time and generate a misleading intermediate impression of the situation. Better to have the prisoner context first. The footage will mean something different with it than it does without it. The directorate did not object. They rarely do, in my experience, when the analyst begins with something anomalous. It signals that the anomaly is real enough to affect procedure, and directorate members are experienced enough to understand that procedural signals have informational content of their own. The 17 prisoners were recovered across all 3 engagements in the Kethvoren corridor. 14 male, 3 female, ages ranging from what our physiological assessment estimated as 22 standard years to approximately 40. All were classified as special operations combatants based on their equipment load, their unit insignia, and the post-engagement testimony of our own forces who had engaged them directly. None of them behaved the way our prior human prisoner data suggested they should, and I want to be specific about what I mean by that. We had 17 previous human prisoners from earlier contacts in adjacent sectors. The behavioral profile across those 17 was consistent and matched our general model for captured combatants under moderate stress. Elevated arousal markers on intake, variable compliance during questioning, some hostile and some cooperative, a range of behaviors all falling within the expected distribution for a species under the specific pressures of capture and confinement. Normal data. Nothing that required a new category. The 17 prisoners from the Kethvoren engagements produced a different profile, and not in ways that suggested acute distress or extreme resilience. They were cooperative. They were calm, and this is the word I kept returning to in my early review of the intake footage, and the word I have since had to complicate substantially, because calm as we typically use it in a prisoner context implies the absence of something, the absence of fear, the absence of agitation, the absence of the physiological load that captures generate in most species. What I was observing was not absence. It was something more like the presence of a state that had been prepared in advance and was now simply in operation. I put the first prisoner interview on the footage wall, not the full transcript, just the intake exchange. 30 seconds of footage. The human seated across a plain table from one of our interview staff, standard intake lighting, standard posture on both sides. The human was a male, approximately late 20s by our estimate, lean-framed, with the particular quality of stillness I have since come to understand is not calm in the passive sense, not the absence of arousal, but something that is, in its own category, a form of preparation held in maintenance. He was not relaxed. He was ready. The difference is not obvious at first viewing. It required my third viewing to see it clearly. Our interviewer asked him to state his name and unit designation. He gave both without hesitation, in a flat and cooperative tone. Our interviewer asked him to describe his unit's tactical objective in the engagement that had resulted in his capture. He said we were covering a withdrawal. Our interviewer asked him to clarify. Did he mean his unit was itself withdrawing? He said no, we were covering someone else's withdrawal. We stayed so they could move. Our interviewer asked him whether he had expected to be recovered. He thought about this for approximately 2 seconds. The footage shows this clearly, a deliberate pause, not the pause of reluctance, but the pause of someone taking a question seriously enough to consider it carefully before answering. Then he said, "That wasn't the primary calculation." I paused the footage. Subdirector Ora Sethis leaned forward slightly in her gallery seat. This is not a gesture she makes in standard review sessions, and I noted it because it suggested that she had already understood something about that sentence that I wanted the rest of the directorate to reach as well. I said, "This answer is what reorganized my entire analysis of the 3 engagements, not the footage, not the positional reconstructions. This sentence, that wasn't the primary calculation. I spent 6 hours working through what it actually meant, tracing the implications back through the engagement record, before I arrived at what I believe is the correct reading. I want to walk the directorate through that reading before we look at any footage, because I think it will change what you see when the footage plays." Most species, I told them when they make tactical decisions under fire, are optimizing for two things simultaneously: the mission objective and their own survival. These two things pull against each other in predictable ways. When mission risk reaches a sufficient level, self-preservation begins to generate competing impulses: hesitation, route-seeking, threshold-crossing behaviors. This is not weakness. It is physiology. It is, in the full context of our understanding of how surviving species evolved to become capable of starflight, the correct design. The species whose self-preservation signals worked correctly are the ones that survived. The species whose fear response accurately modulated risky behavior to preserve individual life in the face of lethal threat are the ones still producing offspring and engineers and soldiers. We have this data for every species in our combat catalog. The threshold varies considerably. Some species surrender earlier, some later. Some require extreme pressure before the self-preservation signal begins to compete meaningfully with mission compliance. But the threshold exists for all of them. It is one of the most reliable cross-species constants in our engagement planning database. When I updated the Variable Aggression Combatant Framework 12 years ago, I built the new version around the threshold as the foundational constant precisely because the data for it was so robust. 19 species, 4 theaters, 11,000 hours of footage. The threshold is always there. What the prisoner from the Keth Voren first engagement told us, in 7 words, is that for his unit in that engagement, the threshold was not functioning as a primary calculation. Not absent, not overcome, not suppressed, not primary. His unit had been assigned to cover a withdrawal. He was performing that function. The question of whether he would survive to be recovered had been present as a variable. He used the word calculation, which implies that a calculation had taken place, that the probability had been assessed, but that variable was secondary. It was downstream of the mission function. It was a consideration that had been noted and then filed behind the execution requirement, not a competing signal generating real-time behavioral pressure. I said, our engagement models assume the threshold is available for exploitation throughout the execution phase of an engagement, that you can apply pressure, and the pressure will reach the threshold, and the threshold will generate behavioral change. The entire planning architecture for contested zone operations is built around the efficiency of this process. The question we ask in planning is not whether threshold crossing will occur, but when and at what pressure level. I said, what this prisoner's answer tells me is that we are asking the wrong question for this unit type. I moved to the second prisoner interview. A female, early 30s by our estimate, recovered from the third engagement. She had been part of a 4-person element that held a stairwell junction in the central corridor structure for approximately 3 hours, while larger human forces withdrew through 2 adjoining passage systems. Her element took 2 casualties in the first hour. She and 1 other survivor held the junction for the remaining 2 hours on their own. Our interviewer asked her, "At what point in the engagement did you consider breaking contact and withdrawing?" She looked at him, and the footage captured her expression with enough resolution that I played it back twice for the full gallery at high magnification. The expression was not hostile. It was not afraid. It was not performing bravery or resignation or any of the emotional registers we typically observe in combatants recounting difficult engagements. It was the expression of someone who had been asked a question that did not quite parse for them, not because it was poorly framed, but because the premise embedded in the question did not correspond to her experience of the situation. She said we had a trigger for breaking contact when the second passage cleared. Our interviewer asked, "And before the trigger?" She said before the trigger we were holding the junction. That was the job. I said to the directorate, she is not being evasive. She is not performing fortitude for the record. Our interviewer's question contains a premise she does not share, the premise that there was a decision available to her during the engagement about when to break contact independently of the trigger condition. There was not. The trigger was the decision point. It had been set in the planning phase. Everything before the trigger was execution of the assigned function. The question of whether she considered independently breaking contact before the trigger is, from her perspective, equivalent to asking whether she considered deciding not to execute her assigned function at all. That is not a decision that was available to her in the execution phase, because she had already made it. The directorate was quiet for a moment. I gave them the quiet. I said, I want to offer one more prisoner exchange before the footage, because this one addresses a question that I assume several members of the directorate will want answered. The question is whether this behavioral profile is specific to elite or specially selected personnel, or whether it is a more general characteristic of this unit type. I put the third interview excerpt on the wall. A male prisoner, older, approximately 38 by our estimate, recovered from the second engagement. He had been a communications element in the engagement, which means he was not in a combat primary role. He was the equivalent of what we would call a technical specialist, present in the engagement in a support function, not a fighting one. Our interviewer asked him, after standard intake questions, when your unit was in contact, did you ever think about moving to a safer position? He said, safer than what? Our interviewer tried to clarify, a position with lower exposure, less direct risk. The prisoner said, that's not how we work. The position you're in is the position the plan needs you in. You don't move out of it because your feelings about it change. I said, this is the communications specialist, not the special operations selected element, not the most trained, most psychologically conditioned personnel in the unit. The technical specialist, present in a support role, articulating the same operational philosophy as the frontline fighters. The mission position is the position. The plan is the architecture. Personal assessment of risk does not generate positional change outside of pre-designated trigger conditions. This is not an individual trait of exceptional combatants. This is a unit-level operating principle. I paused, then I moved to the footage. The first engagement was 11 days before the review session. A directorate advance element, 47 personnel, standard assault configuration, entered what tactical mapping had classified as a contested ridge approach. Pre-engagement surveillance had identified a human defensive position on the ridge itself, estimated 12 to 15 personnel, light weapons, no heavy emplacement. Standard suppression and advance scenario. Our forces moved in from the eastern approach corridor as planned. I played the footage from our own forward reconnaissance units. The advance went as modeled for approximately the first 14 minutes. Contact was established with the human position at the expected range. The humans returned fire from 3 points along the ridge face. Standard defensive geometry, 1 central element and 2 flanking elements, each firing from covered positions, maintaining consistent pressure. Our forces advanced under suppression in the standard extended line configuration. Then the humans on the ridge withdrew. Not broke, withdrew. There is a difference, and it is important, and it is the thing our initial after-action report missed. The difference is control. A broken contact generates scatter, speed, asymmetric movement, the individual self-preservation signal overriding unit cohesion, producing the characteristic pattern of a force that has exceeded its threshold. A controlled withdrawal generates sequenced movement, maintained mutual support, consistent tempo. It looks deliberate. It looks rehearsed. The withdrawal looked deliberate and rehearsed. One fire element covering while another moved. They went up and over the ridge line in pairs and disappeared from our surveillance coverage into the terrain on the far slope. Our forces took the ridge. 41 personnel, 6 casualties within projected parameters. The after-action report logged it as a successful positional seizure with light resistance. The assessment note read, human element withdrew under pressure, consistent with threshold crossing behavior under asymmetric engagement. I paused the footage. I said, this is how I initially read it as well, and I want the directorate to understand why it was an entirely reasonable initial reading. 14 minutes of contact, then withdrawal when the pressure became sufficient. That is the pattern. That is exactly what threshold crossing looks like when it occurs at the early range of the distribution for a given species under a given pressure load. Nothing in the footage of the engagement itself would have told us anything different. I said, now I want to show you what the human element was doing while we were writing that assessment. I switched footage sources. This required a brief explanation. The second set of footage was recovered from a damaged human communication device found in the terrain 600 meters behind the original ridge position, recovered during a sweep operation 3 days after the engagement. It was not our surveillance footage. It was internal unit communication, audio with positional tracking data embedded. Our technical division had spent 4 days reconstructing the positional data into a visual format compatible with our standard review displays. The audio was partially degraded, but the positional track was intact. I put both feeds on the wall simultaneously. Our own advanced footage on the left panel, the reconstructed human internal positional track on the right. While our forces were advancing on the ridge under what we had read as suppressive defense, the human element on the ridge was not defending. They were positioning. The 3 fire points visible in our footage, central and 2 flanking, were not a defensive structure. They were the visible portion of a larger architecture, specifically designed to be the visible portion, the part we were supposed to see and respond to. While those 2 fire elements held our attention on the ridge face, a third element, 4 personnel, was moving laterally under cover, relocating 140 meters to the north of the ridge line, into a drainage feature that our pre-engagement surveillance had not flagged as a concealment risk because it appeared shallow and exposed. It was not shallow. The reconstruction showed a depth variation our initial survey had missed. 4 human personnel could lie flat in it, motionless, without being visible from the approach corridor or from standard aerial surveillance geometry. When the 2 fire elements withdrew up and over the ridge, they did not leave the area. They descended the far side approximately 40 meters and stopped. They went prone on the far slope. They became, as far as our surveillance coverage was concerned, indistinguishable from the terrain. Our forces took the ridge. Standard post-seizure protocol, a perimeter element up and over the ridge to confirm withdrawal, verify the far slope, ensure the position was clear before consolidating. 6 personnel executing standard confirmation sweep. The 4 humans in the drainage feature, 140 meters to the north, engaged the perimeter sweep element from the flank at a range our reconstruction later calculated as 210 meters. All 6 Directorate perimeter personnel were casualties in 40 seconds. Concentrated, accurate, and I want to use the precise technical term for this, surgical. Each human in that drainage feature had a pre-assigned sector of the perimeter sweep element. The casualties did not cluster randomly. They were distributed across the sweep element in a pattern consistent with pre-assigned targeting. They had divided the sweep team before the sweep team appeared, in the planning phase, based on a predicted standard protocol sweep configuration. The 2 fire elements on the far slope, the ones who had, in our original account, withdrawn under pressure, came back over the ridge from behind and engaged our main force from their exposed rear at the same moment. The drainage feature element was engaging the perimeter sweep. The engagement lasted 7 more minutes. We took 11 additional casualties before our forces broke contact entirely and withdrew from the ridge. The humans did not pursue. They reoccupied the ridge. Our after-action report was revised from successful positional seizure to contested engagement, net negative. The revision was filed 2 days after the original. The directorate was very quiet. I could see Subdirector Orasethiz's hands flat on the gallery rail in front of her, not tense, but still, the way hands are when a person has decided to be very careful about their physical reactions. I said, I want to be precise about what I am showing you. The withdrawal was the attack. The human element retreated from the ridge deliberately, at a predetermined rate, executing a pre-planned sequence designed to pull our perimeter check across a kill line that had been established before the engagement began. The 3 fire positions were not there to hold the ridge. They were there to make the withdrawal look like what our model said withdrawal should look like, to make us write the assessment we wrote. I said, and I want to make the scale of this clear, 12 people planned this. In a 12-person element, they distributed the entire engagement architecture. Who fires, who moves laterally, who waits on the far slope, who watches the drainage feature, what the triggers are for each transition, what the assigned targets are for the drainage feature element before the perimeter sweep arrives across all 12 personnel. They executed this architecture without a command signal we could identify during the execution phase. The communication log I described earlier shows minimal traffic during execution. They had one exchange at the 14-minute mark, 6 seconds of audio, partially degraded, from which our technical team could recover approximately 4 words. The exchange was not an order. It was a confirmation. The plan was complete before the engagement began. The execution was the plan running. I moved to the second engagement. 3 days after the first, a larger directorate element, 88 personnel, tasked with securing the approach corridor south of the ridge following the revised assessment. Our planning staff, in the 3 days between the first and second engagements, had developed revised protocols specifically designed to account for the deception pattern we had observed. We adjusted our perimeter confirmation procedures to reduce the predictability of post-seizure sweeps. We expanded our surveillance coverage to include concealment features we had previously assessed as low risk. We changed our advanced geometry to reduce flank exposure and maintain greater mutual support between elements throughout the advance. I want the Directorate to hold these adaptations in mind. The second engagement footage ran to 41 minutes. I played it in full. This is unusual in a Directorate review. Normally, I would excerpt and annotate, running approximately 20% of the original footage. I played it in full because I had found, in my own review process, that the excerpts did not adequately convey what the full sequence conveyed. The engagement was designed to be understood as a sequence, and the significance of each segment was partly derived from its position in the sequence. Excerpts disrupted this. You needed to watch all 41 minutes to understand what you were looking at. The engagement began with initial contact in the approach corridor at the positions our surveillance had flagged. Human elements engaged from prepared positions in a wide arc to our left, a different geometry than the first engagement, which itself was a datum worth noting. Our adapted advance protocol performed as designed. We did not advance directly into the contact. We held, expanded surveillance coverage, looked for the lateral movement pattern that had preceded the ridge event. Our surveillance teams were specifically tasked with this. It was the adjustment we had built in. We found what we were looking for. Human elements moving north along a gully feature, approximately consistent with what our revised protocols had projected as a likely secondary maneuver. We had anticipated this. We redirected assault elements to intercept the gully movement before it could complete a lateral repositioning. The human elements in the gully, when our intercept force approached, broke contact and fell back north. Our intercept elements followed. This was within our revised planning parameters. We had built follow-through into the protocol to prevent the repositioning from completing even if initially detected. At the 22-minute mark, the contact arc on our left flank abruptly ceased. The human element that had been engaging us simply stopped, went quiet. No movement, no withdrawal pattern, no audio contact. Our forces held position. We had experienced the cost of advancing into apparent silence in the first engagement. We waited. We expanded surveillance. We looked for the deception to declare its architecture. At the 24-minute mark, a human element we had not identified engaged from a position directly behind our held main force, from the approach corridor we had entered through. Not from a flanking position, not from a concealed lateral position our surveillance had missed. From behind. They had been positioned in our entry corridor before we arrived, in concealment, before our surveillance sweep had cleared that sector, before our advance element had passed through. They were there before we were. The engagement from the rear lasted 4 minutes before that element also broke contact and withdrew south, further into the corridor we had entered from. Our intercept elements, now 2 kilometers north in pursuit of the gully units which had continued withdrawing, were recalled. By the time they returned to the main force position, the approach corridor was clear. Human elements had gone to ground. Our forces held the corridor. I paused. I said, I want to show the directorate the positional overlay. I put it on the full wall, a top-down map of the approach corridor and surrounding terrain, with the reconstructed movement tracks of all identified human elements rendered across the full 41 minutes. Red for human, blue for hours. The animation ran at 1/5 speed. The room went quiet in a different way than it had during the first engagement. The first engagement had produced the silence of surprise, the surprise of people who have just understood that they missed something significant. The second engagement produced a different silence. The silence of people beginning to see the shape of what they are dealing with, not fully yet, but enough to understand that the shape is larger than the previous engagement suggested. What the overlay showed, rendered complete, was not the pattern of a force responding to our advance. It was not the pattern of a force improvising countermeasures in reaction to our adapted protocols. It was the pattern of a force that had anticipated our adapted protocols, mapped them precisely, and positioned its elements in advance to address each specific adaptation. The gully movement had been designed to draw our intercept element north, away from the main corridor, which it did. The flank silence had been designed to make us hold and wait at the position where the rear corridor element could engage us, which it did. The rear corridor element had been positioned in our entry corridor before the engagement began, in the gap that our revised advanced geometry had opened between our entry route and our new flank exposed formation. They had found the gap in our revision, the gap we had created by adjusting to the first engagement. They had found it before the second engagement began, in the planning phase, and placed an element in it. I said, the humans adjusted to our adjusted protocol before the engagement began. Not during it, before it. They read our revised advanced geometry from our pre-engagement positioning, from our approach route, from the placement of our surveillance assets, from the geometry of our entry formation, and they revised their engagement architecture in response. In the approximately 90-minute window between our arrival in the approach corridor and first contact, they had repositioned at least 3 separate elements to address our specific adaptations. Director Velhanen said, 90 minutes. I said, 90 minutes, yes. He said, our planning staff had 3 days. I said, yes. He said nothing after that for a moment, and then he said, how many personnel in the second engagement? I said, an estimated 22. We had 88. The revised protocols that they adapted to in 90 minutes were developed by a planning staff of 9 over 3 days. I have reviewed the human communication logs from the 90-minute per contact window. Traffic was light. There was no indication of a formal planning session, no extended communication periods that would suggest a deliberate group planning process. What the logs suggest is a series of short confirmatory exchanges, the kind that occurs when a plan already exists and small adjustments are being communicated, not built. Subdirector Orasethai said, quietly, they already had the plan. I said, that is my conclusion as well. They had a base architecture. When we arrived, they read our approach and made targeted adjustments, not a new plan, an adjustment to an existing plan. The cognitive load for that is substantially different from the load of building a response from scratch in 90 minutes. She said nothing after that for a moment. I said, I want to note something that is easy to miss in the footage summary, but becomes significant in the context of the third engagement. In both the first and second engagements, the humans took casualties. 5 in the first, 4 in the second. In both cases, the casualties occurred in the elements whose function was to absorb contact, to be visible, to be engaged, to hold attention while the decisive function elements completed their repositioning or execution. The elements with the critical positional roles, the ones whose actions would determine whether the engagement architecture succeeded or failed, did not take casualties in either engagement. 2 engagements in a row. The exposed elements absorbed the cost. The decisive elements did not. I said, this was not accident. The engagement architecture in both cases distributed exposure deliberately. The elements whose survival was required for the plan to execute correctly were the ones that were protected from contact during the periods when their positional role was still developing. The elements whose function was to absorb contact, to be the visible, engageable presence that drew our response, were the ones positioned in front. Director Velhanen said, they planned which of their personnel would be in the line. I said, yes, and those personnel knew it. The planning process was collective. The communication logs and the prisoner interviews both support this conclusion. The function assignments were made in the presence of all personnel. Everyone knew who was in front. Everyone knew what being in front meant. And the elements assigned to those functions held them in both engagements until the trigger conditions for their withdrawal were met. The room was quiet again. I let it be. I moved to the third engagement. This was the one that had generated the original cost discrepancy, 7 days after the second engagement. The Directorate had, following the second after-action revision, escalated to a full contested zone clearance operation. 160 personnel, full surveillance and suppression assets, a 3-pronged advance designed to minimize the flank exposure vulnerabilities our previous advances had demonstrated, and to reduce the possibility of the encirclement and redirect pattern we had now observed twice. The human presence in the corridor zone was estimated at 30 to 40 personnel based on the engagement records. The clearance operation lasted 9 hours. We entered with 160 personnel. We withdrew, ultimately, finally, after the 9th hour with 111, 49 casualties. 3 times the projected loss tolerance for a contested zone clearance against an estimated 30 to 40 defenders. I played the footage without annotation for the first hour. I will explain why in a moment, but first I want to say that this decision, to run an hour of footage without commentary in a Directorate review, is highly unusual, and I want to acknowledge that it was a deliberate choice. The reason is the same reason I inverted the standard order and showed the prisoner interviews first. The experience of watching the footage as our forces in that corridor experienced it, as a sequence of individually coherent operational events that accumulate into an outcome no pre-engagement model had projected, is itself informational. If I annotate in real time, the Directorate understands the architecture before they have felt the weight of it accumulating. I needed them to feel the weight first. The 3-pronged advance made contact at the expected positions. Human elements engaged, held briefly, withdrew, and this time our forces did not pursue. We had learned that lesson across 2 engagements. We held expanded surveillance, waited for the deception to declare itself. The surveillance teams were looking for the lateral repositioning, the concealment feature placement. The element moving into the gap in our formation. We were looking, and we were patient. It took 11 minutes. The human elements fell back to a second prepared line. Positions inside the corridor structure itself, the building complex that occupied the central corridor section, reinforced, clearly prepared over a period of time, clearly occupied by the weight of the suppressive fire coming out of it. And then they stopped. They did not continue withdrawing. They held the second line. This was new. In the first and second engagements, the withdrawal had been the architecture, The withdrawal was how the deception worked. Here, the human elements were holding at the second line under our suppression pressure. Our surveillance teams found the lateral movement they were looking for, flagged it, and we redirected to intercept. The human elements flagged by surveillance broke contact and fell back north, and our intercept force followed, correctly, by protocol, completing the interception before it could become a repositioning threat. At the 4-hour mark, our central prong had advanced approximately 800 meters under the sustained engagement with the second line. The advance was slow and costly. The human elements at the second line were fighting for each position in a way that our model classified as determined resistance, not as deception architecture. Our suppression assets were working. We were giving ground on the loss rate slightly above projection, but within the range that a prepared position with motivated defenders would generate. It felt like a hard fight against a well-prepared opponent. It felt, specifically, like the kind of fight we understood and knew how to push through. We committed the central prong to the push on the main building complex, pulled resources from the flanking prongs to weight the central advance. The building was the main position. The suppressive fire was coming from it. Our surveillance confirmed activity inside. We advanced on it. I said, "Stop watching the left panel. Watch only the right panel." The positional overlay, all elements, all 41 minutes to that point, rendered simultaneously. The human second line, the one that had held for 4 hours, that had absorbed our suppression, that had drawn our resources toward the central axis, was not the main position. It was the function the ridge withdrawal had performed in the first engagement, and the gully movement had performed in the second, scaled to a 9-hour operation against a 160-person force. The building was not their main position. The building was the thing we were supposed to assault. It was lightly held. The suppressive fire we had been taking was produced by a fraction of the human force available, concentrated in positions designed to make the building look more heavily defended than it was. While we had been advancing on the building for 4 hours, the human flanking elements, the ones maintaining measured contact with our flanking prongs, giving ground at that consistent, acceptable, model-consistent rate, had been doing two things simultaneously: maintaining the appearance of contested withdrawal in front of our flanking prongs, and repositioning the bulk of their available personnel into prepared positions on our flanks that our surveillance had not identified, because those positions had been prepared before our surveillance sweep, in the days before the engagement. In terrain, our pre-engagement assessment had flagged as low concealment risk. At the 4-hour 16-minute mark, our flanking prongs, committed and extended in pursuit of the withdrawing human elements, were engaged simultaneously on both flanks and from the front by the full human force that had been maintaining measured contact with them. At the same moment, the element in the main building broke contact and left through prepared exits in the building's rear, leaving our central assault force advancing into a lightly held position, while the flanks were overextended and under full engagement. I will not describe the 9-hour engagement in its full detail here. The record contains every timestamp, every positional transition, every casualty report. What I will say is that for 4 hours, our forces had been advancing on what we believed was the human main position, and for those same 4 hours, the human forces had been using our advance as cover for a repositioning that transformed our flanks from a support structure into an exposure. When the repositioning executed, our flanks could not consolidate without withdrawing through contact. Our central force, at the objective, was isolated. I will say one more thing about those 9 hours, because it is not in the casualty record and it is not in the positional timeline, and it is the detail that has stayed with me most persistently across the weeks of this review. At the 6-hour mark, our forces had established a partial consolidation in the central corridor zone. We had taken 31 casualties by that point. Our command element, recognizing the flank overextension, was attempting to pull the advance back to a defensible geometry while suppression assets covered the withdrawal. The human elements were not pressing hard into this consolidation. They were maintaining contact but not escalating it. Steady pressure, consistent pace, no surge. Our communications intercept teams, who had been monitoring the human frequency bands throughout the engagement, recorded 11 minutes of silence from the human side at this point. No traffic, no confirmatory exchanges, no positional updates. For 11 minutes, in the middle of a 9-hour engagement, the human elements produced no communication we could intercept. When our intercept team flagged this, the initial interpretation was a communications failure on the human side, equipment damage, battery depletion, something technical. Our engagement planning had not anticipated a human communications outage, and our forces adjusted to account for it as a possible sign of deteriorating human capability. The intercept silence lasted 11 minutes and then ended with a single short exchange. Our technical team recovered it. 7 words clearly transmitted. The words were, "As planned, stand by for trigger." I replayed that exchange for the directorate on the full wall. 7 words. The silence before them was not a communications failure. It was the transition from execution of one phase to preparation for the next. The human elements had ceased all non-essential communication because they were in the final positioning movement before the trigger condition executed. 11 minutes of total silence, in the middle of a contested zone engagement against a numerically superior force, while repositioning elements that would determine the outcome of the engagement. Our forces interpreted the silence as deterioration. It was preparation. Our after-action review team, when they reconstructed the 6-hour timeline against the positional overlay, found that the 11-minute silence corresponded precisely to the window in which 3 human elements completed repositioning from their maintained contact positions on our flanks to the prepared concealment positions from which they would execute the simultaneous flank engagement. The silence was the movement window. It ended when the movement was complete. The 7 words were confirmation of position. And then they waited 4 more hours in those positions, maintaining the appearance of continued measured contact with our flank prongs, until the trigger condition, our central prong's commitment to the assault on the building, was met. 49 casualties over 9 hours, 30 to 40 personnel against 160, with full suppression assets. The human force held the corridor for 9 hours and withdrew at their own choosing when they judged the objective complete. I stopped the footage. I said, I want to return to the prisoners before I offer conclusions. I put the late session interview footage on the wall. Not intake, a session conducted on day 4 of detention, with the senior non-commissioned officer recovered from the 3rd engagement. He was calm in the same way all 17 prisoners were calm, prepared rather than relaxed. He had been asked our non-standard question, the one I had added to the protocol after the first engagement review. The question was, when your unit plans an engagement and assigns exposed functions to specific personnel, what is the internal experience of making that assignment? Not the tactical reasoning, the internal experience. He thought about this for what the timestamp records as 11 seconds. Then he said, "You're trying to win. You look at the geometry, you look at what each element needs to do for the plan to work, and you put people in the positions where they're most effective. Some of those positions are in front. The people you put in front know they're in front. They know what in front means." The interviewer asked, and they accept it. He said they've already accepted it, before the planning session. The acceptance is part of how you come to this job. The interviewer asked, "How do you mean?" He said, "I mean that everyone who does this work has already answered the question. You answer it before you're ever in a room where it applies to you specifically. You answer it in training and then you answer it again every time you go out. The answer is always the same. The answer is, yes, that's the job. So when the planning session happens and someone gets assigned the front position, they're not answering the question again. It's already been answered. They're just being told when it applies. I stopped the footage. I said, he is describing a pre-commitment architecture, not an order that is given and obeyed under duress, not a command that overrides self-preservation through authority, a question that is asked and answered in advance in a context where fear is not present, so that when fear arrives, the answer is already filed. The decision is already made. Fear is present. The metabolic data confirms it. But it arrives in an environment where the relevant decision is not available for revision because it has already been resolved. I said, this is what I meant earlier when I said the threshold has not been eliminated. It has been relocated. These units in the planning phase ask themselves the question that the threshold is supposed to answer under fire. Will you hold this position? Will you accept this function? Will you stay? And they answer it before the fire. When the fire comes, the question is not available. They are not in the engagement deciding to be brave. They are executing a decision they made earlier. The courage, if that is the word, happened in a room without bullets in it. And what happens on the objective is not courage at all. It is competence. Director Velhanen said, what was the objective of the third engagement? I said, the corridor. They held it for 9 hours and withdrew intact when our forces could no longer prosecute the engagement effectively. The objective was the same as the first engagement. The corridor, the ridge, the approach, the same ground, defended at the same sustained cost to us across 3 engagements. Each engagement more expensive than the one before. Each engagement an expression of the same architecture, scaled to the force we brought. He said, they knew we would escalate. I said, every adaptation we made, the revised perimeter protocols, the expanded surveillance, the 3-pronged formation, the full suppression asset deployment, every one of them appears in the human engagement planning from the second and third engagements as an anticipated variable that was accounted for in the architecture. They did not respond to our adaptations. They planned for them. Subdirector Orasethai said, how do you plan against that? I said, that is the question I have been working on for 6 weeks, and I want to give the directorate an honest answer rather than a reassuring one. The honest answer is that the standard engagement model cannot plan against it, because the standard model is built around threshold exploitation. You identify the threshold, apply sufficient pressure to cross it, and the opposing force's behavior changes in a predictable direction. The entire planning architecture for contested zone operations rests on this. When the threshold cannot be reached in the execution phase, because the decisions that the threshold is designed to influence have already been made, in the planning phase, in a room you were not in, the model produces cost projections that are systematically wrong in one direction. I said, the adaptation recommendation I am filing is not more pressure. More pressure produces more casualties on both sides and does not change the engagement architecture. The recommendation is that we revise the framework for this unit type to account for the planning phase decision structure, and to recognize that interdiction of this type of force needs to target the planning phase, the room where the decisions are made, the period before the engagement begins. Because once the engagement begins, the decisions are no longer available for disruption. Director Velhanen said, and if we cannot access the planning phase, I said, then we should understand clearly what we are engaging. We are not engaging a force that can be persuaded to stop by applying sufficient cost. We are engaging a plan. The people executing it are not, during execution, capable of choosing not to execute it, not because they have been compelled or suppressed, but because the choice is no longer where they are. The choice happened earlier, somewhere else, in a room we were not in, and we did not know to disrupt it at the time. The session ended. The directorate filed out in a silence that had settled over the room in the last 30 minutes of the presentation, not the animated quiet of a staff generating action items, but the other kind. The kind that comes when the shape of a problem has changed, and the new shape has not yet been translated into language specific enough to produce decisions. Director Velhanen paused at the gallery exit and looked at me for a moment before leaving. He did not say anything. I noted that as well. I remained in Assessment Theater 12 after they left. Sat with the display wall inactive, the overhead panels at their dimmed resting level, the institutional blue of the ambient systems the only color in the room. The hollow panels had gone to standby, leaving only the cool overhead grid and the soft glow of the equipment indicators at the analyst station. I had reviewed 11,000 hours of combat footage across 31 years, and I sat in that light for approximately 20 minutes without moving, because I was finishing something. The thing I was finishing was not the analysis. The analysis was filed, or nearly so. What I was finishing was the process of accepting a revision to something I had held as a foundational principle for most of my professional life. I had built the variable aggression combatant framework around a principle I had understood to be a constant. Everything has a threshold. Put sufficient, correctly calibrated pressure on a combatant, any combatant of any species in any configuration, and the self-preservation signal will eventually compete with and then override the mission compliance signal. The threshold varies. The pressure required varies. The timeline varies enormously, but the threshold exists. It is there. It is the thing you find and exploit. The art of engagement planning is locating it precisely and applying the correct pressure to the correct location at the correct rate. I had been confident in this principle because the evidence for it was comprehensive. Not merely robust, comprehensive. 19 species across 4 theaters over 31 years. Combat engagements under every condition our catalog contained. Superior numbers, inferior numbers, extended duration, sudden onset, sustained suppression, isolation, encirclement, injury load accumulation. The threshold was present in every species, in every configuration, in every condition. Some thresholds were high. Some were very high. Some species required extreme and sustained pressure before the self-preservation signal reached competitive magnitude. But the threshold was always there, and once I found it, the engagement became predictable. What the Keth-Voren engagements showed me is that the threshold is not a biological constant. It is an architectural one. It is a feature of decision-making systems that maintain the survival calculation as an active variable throughout the execution phase. Some systems have a different architecture. The survival calculation is present. The metabolic data, across all 17 prisoners, confirmed the presence of all standard physiological fear markers throughout the engagements. The signal was working correctly. The signal was being generated. The signal simply did not have access to the decision architecture during the execution phase, because the decision architecture had been completed and closed in the planning phase. The metaphor I kept returning to, sitting in that room, was a door. In most species, the survival signal is always trying the handle. The execution phase is a room with a door the survival signal has continuous access to. Apply sufficient pressure, and the signal pushes the door open. The threshold is the pressure required to move the door. You find the threshold, you apply the pressure, the door opens, and the combatant's behavior changes in a direction you can predict and exploit. These units had gone through the door themselves, in the planning phase. Resolved what was on the other side and locked it from within. When the survival signal arrived during execution, it found a locked door. It could generate all the pressure its physiology could produce. The door did not open. I want to be precise. They did not eliminate the survival signal. They did not suppress it or extinguish it or evolve past it. They made a prior appointment with what the signal was trying to generate, a decision about whether the function was worth the cost, and they kept the appointment in advance in a controlled context when the question was abstract rather than immediate. They answered the question without the pressure, so that the pressure could not reopen the question. The prisoner had used the word rehearsal. They built the muscle for carrying the weight before the weight arrived. The rehearsal was not tactical practice, or not only tactical practice. It was also the practice of answering the question repeatedly until the answer was sufficiently embedded that it did not need to be asked again when the circumstances made asking it feel most urgent. This is, I understand, a thing human beings have been doing in various forms for as long as they have been sending some of their members into lethal situations on behalf of the others. It is not new. What is new in these units is the precision of the architecture, the deliberateness with which the question is posed and answered in advance, the specificity with which the answer is calibrated to exact operational conditions, and the degree to which the entire unit has collectively and individually resolved the same question to the same answer before entering the same engagement. 17 prisoners, 17 separate individuals, 17 separate metabolic profiles showing standard fear-response physiological markers during their respective engagements, 17 separate behavioral profiles in detention showing the same prepared calm state. And when you ask any of them the relevant question, the question about function and exposure and self-preservation, they give you the same answer, in different words, with different phrasing and different individual texture, but the same underlying architecture. They answered it before they needed to answer it. That is the job. I filed the formal assessment the following morning. Classification revision for human special operations combatants. Engagement model amendment recommendation. A new category designation in the variable aggression combatant catalog. I called it pre-committed threshold architecture. The language is precise enough for the record. It does not fully say what I mean. What I mean is simpler and less convenient. The senior non-commissioned officer from the interview footage was repatriated in a prisoner exchange 14 weeks after the engagements. Standard protocol. Before the transfer, I submitted a non-standard interview request through detention administration, flagged as analytic clarification, personal discretion of the reviewing analyst. I was granted 8 minutes. I noted that he looked the same as he had looked on day 4 of detention. The same prepared stillness. 14 weeks of confinement had not produced the behavioral degradation our detention models predicted for extended holds. Our models projected that most combatant species, held beyond 8 weeks without mission activity, showed measurable changes in the prepared calm baseline, increased agitation markers, decreased cooperative response, the gradual erosion of the trained state. His baseline had not eroded. If anything, it appeared more settled than the day 4 footage. I noted this in the pre-transfer assessment and did not have a model category for it. I asked him one question. I told him it was not for the formal record. I said, when your unit plans an engagement and assigns someone to an exposed function, a position where the probability of their not surviving is substantial, and that person accepts it and then does not survive it, what do you do with that? He looked at me for a moment with the same quality of attention I had cataloged across all 17 prisoners, measured, direct, not performing anything. He said, you make sure the plan worked. You make sure the function held. That's what they were there for. If it held, you carry that. You carry it straight. I said, and if you assigned them there and the plan did not work? He said, then you find out why it did not work and you fix it and you go back. I said, does it accumulate, the carrying of it? He thought about this for longer than he had thought about any other question in the 8 minutes we had together. Not reluctance, thought. The same 11 seconds of considered pause I had cataloged in the day 4 interview scaled up. Then he said, yes, but that's the job too. You carry it or you don't do the job. And if you don't do the job, someone else does it less well and more people don't come back. So you carry it. You get used to the weight, not because the weight gets lighter, but because you built the muscle for it a long time ago. That's what the rehearsal is for. He stood. The transfer escort was at the door. He looked at me once more with that same measured attention, the gaze of someone who has spent time thinking about what you do and has filed it in a place he can access again later, without urgency, and then he left. I sat in the interview room for a while afterward, not reviewing anything. The notepad in front of me was blank. I had what I needed, and I was not certain I had language for it, and I was not certain language was the point. I had spent 31 years learning how to find the threshold, the point where a combatant's self-preservation signal became strong enough to change their behavior, the point where you had applied sufficient cost that the calculation tipped and the force became predictable in a new direction. I had built a career on the precision of that identification. I was good at it. I am still good at it. It works on 19 species and it works well. These units had not eliminated the self-preservation signal. They had not suppressed it or pharmacologically neutralized it or evolved past it. They had done something more deliberate than any of those things. They had made a prior appointment with it. They had gone to the place where the signal lived, the rehearsal, the planning session, the repeated practice of deciding before they needed to decide, and they had answered the question there, in the cold, before the fire was lit. And when the fire was lit, the answer was already given, and the signal arrived at an empty room. What I still do not know, what I could not determine from 17 prisoners, 3 engagement reconstructions, and 8 minutes in a repatriation interview room, is whether this architecture is something these units are made to carry by the institutions that train them, or whether it is something they arrive at individually and bring to the institution, whether it is imposed or chosen, whether they were given this weight to carry or whether they reached for it themselves. I asked none of the 17 prisoners this question directly because I did not know, until I was sitting across from the last of them in the transfer room, that it was the question I had been building toward all along. By then, I had 8 minutes, and I had asked the question I had come to ask, and the answer had been given, and I let the rest of it go. I think it is chosen. I think the architecture exists because they built it, individually and collectively, and keep building it each time they rehearse, each time they go through the planning session, each time they accept a function and then go and do it, and then come back and carry what comes back with them. I think it is a practice, in the original sense of that word, a thing practiced until the capacity for it is structural rather than effortful. I think the weight gets no lighter but the carrier gets no weaker either, and the whole arrangement is held in equilibrium by the continued practice of answering the question before the question becomes urgent. That is my best account of what I observed. It is not in the formal record. It would not survive a standards review in the form I have just stated it. But it is the most honest thing I can offer at the end of 6 weeks and 4 hours and 11 minutes in a room with the footage wall and the directorate's silence. The formal assessment record runs to 642 pages. The classification amendments, the engagement model revisions, the framework update, the interdiction recommendations, all of it is there, precise and defensible and useful to the planners who will work with it. At the bottom of the summary addendum, in the conclusions field, I wrote 2 sentences. They are the most precise sentences in the entire record, and I mean every word of them. And I do not expect them to translate cleanly into any planning application, but I needed them to exist in the document. The first, human special operations units do not lose ground because they cannot hold it. The second, they abandon it because they have already decided what they are trading it for.